I'm Yolanda Turner, 42 years old, and 3 months ago, a racist bank manager dismissed my loan application without even opening the folder, assuming I couldn't afford what I was applying for. The humiliation I felt in that moment, sitting across from this man who saw my black face and immediately decided I wasn't worth his time, nearly broke me. But what that bank did next was even worse. They tried to cover it up and protect him when I filed a complaint. If you've ever experienced racism in banking, lending, or any financial institution, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. My journey to that bank didn't start that day. It began 22 years ago when I graduated from Howard University with a degree in business administration, carrying dreams bigger than the student loan debt weighing me down. My grandmother, Essie, who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8, used to tell me, "Baby girl, they gonna try to make you small, but you were born to take up space in this world." She'd survived Jim Crow in rural Georgia, worked as a domestic for white families while putting herself through night school, and eventually became the first black teacher in our county. Her wisdom shaped everything I understood about navigating white spaces while maintaining my dignity. Those early years weren't easy. I started as a junior analyst at a predominantly white investment firm in downtown Atlanta, where I was often the only black face in the room. I learned to code switch effortlessly, speaking with perfect diction in meetings while letting my natural voice flow when I called my grandmother each evening. I watched white colleagues with less experience get promoted faster, saw how their mistakes were treated as learning opportunities while mine were scrutinized under a microscope. But I persevered, working twice as hard and staying twice as late, because Grandma Essie's voice was always in my head. Excellence is your resistance, Yolanda. Every door they try to close, you kick it open with your achievements. My breakthrough came when I identified a pattern of discriminatory lending practices at our firm. Ironically, the same kind of discrimination I'd later face myself. My report led to a federal investigation and substantial changes in company policy. Suddenly, I wasn't just surviving in that white space, I was thriving. Promotions followed, along with recognition from industry publications. By 35, I was a senior vice president, owning a beautiful home in Cascade Heights, and mentoring young black professionals who reminded me of my younger self. The cultural foundation that sustained me came from Sunday dinners at Mount Olive Baptist Church, where the congregation felt like extended family. We'd gather after service at Miss Ruby's house, the church mother who made the best mac and cheese in all of Atlanta. Her dining room table was where I learned about community wealth building, where deacons discussed everything from supporting black-owned businesses to navigating workplace racism. It was where I met Jordan, my husband of 8 years, a high school principal who shared my passion for uplift and progress. Our home became a gathering place too, hosting book clubs focused on black authors, financial literacy workshops for young couples, and strategy sessions for parents navigating their children's education in predominantly white schools. Success felt solid by 40. I'd been featured in Black Enterprise magazine as one of 40 under 40 inches young executives to watch. My investment portfolio was diversified, my retirement accounts were robust, and I was ready to make my next big move. Jordan and I had been talking about opening a community development financial institution, a black-owned bank that would serve families like the ones we grew up in, families that traditional banks often overlooked or exploited. We'd saved $150,000 for the down payment and initial operating costs. My business plan was meticulous, developed over 2 years with input from mentors at the National Bankers Association, and blessed by the financial wisdom I'd gained from managing millions in client assets. But even in my success, I felt the persistent weight of being watched, evaluated, questioned in ways my white counterparts weren't. There were the microaggressions, being asked to speak for all black people in diversity meetings, having white colleagues touch my hair without permission, being told I was articulate like it was a surprise. There were the moments when I walked into high-end stores and felt sales associates following me, or when I arrived at business dinners and was mistaken for the catering staff. I'd learned to document everything, keeping detailed records of meetings and email trails, because I'd seen too many brilliant black women have their contributions erased or their competence questioned. The signs were there even before I walked into that bank 3 months ago. When I called to schedule the appointment, the loan officer seemed surprised when I mentioned the amount I wanted to borrow. When I arrived 15 minutes early, I sat in the waiting area and watched 3 white clients get called back on time while I waited an additional 30 minutes. I noticed how the receptionist's demeanor changed when I approached her desk, the forced smile, the way she spoke just a little too slowly, as if I might not understand basic banking terminology. But I was prepared, confident, carrying a folder thick with documentation that proved my creditworthiness beyond any shadow of doubt. My family's history in banking was complicated, like most black families in America. Grandma Essie used to tell stories about her father, who kept his money in a coffee can buried in their backyard because the local bank wouldn't serve black customers. She remembered the humiliation of having to send white friends to conduct business she couldn't do herself, the way banks would charge black families higher interest rates for the same loans they offered white families at prime rates. Eee. The system was built to keep us out, she'd explain. But every generation has to push those doors open a little wider. That's why starting our own bank mattered so much. I'd seen the statistics, how black families were still denied loans at twice the rate of white families with identical credit profiles, how our communities remained underbanked while predatory lenders targeted us with subprime products. I wanted to create something different, an institution that understood our community's needs and respected our financial intelligence. I'd studied successful models like One United Bank and Citizens Trust Bank, institutions that proved black banks could be both profitable and principled. My professional identity had been carefully constructed over 2 decades of proving myself in white corporate spaces. I knew how to walk into any boardroom with confidence, how to command respect through expertise and preparation. I'd learned to navigate the coded language of corporate America, understanding when cultural fit meant too black and when aggressive was code for spoke up while black. I'd mentored dozens of young black professionals, teaching them the unspoken rules of advancement while encouraging them to maintain their authentic selves. The morning I went to that bank, I followed my usual routine. Early workout at the gym, meditation and prayer, then breakfast while reviewing my presentation materials one final time. I wore my navy blue power suit, the one that made me feel invincible, that had been with me through every major career milestone. My natural hair was twisted into an elegant updo, my makeup flawless, my leather portfolio organized with military precision. I was ready to do business with equals, confident that my preparation would speak for itself. Jordan kissed me goodbye that morning and said, "Go get our bank, baby. The community is counting on us." I felt the weight of that responsibility and the excitement of possibility. This wasn't just about Yolanda Turner's business dreams. It was about creating opportunities for families who'd been shut out of traditional banking for generations. I thought about the young black entrepreneurs I mentored, the churches that needed construction loans, the families who deserved mortgages without predatory terms. But as I drove toward downtown, I felt a familiar tension in my shoulders, the hypervigilance that never quite goes away when you're black in America. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations, to read the subtle signs of hostility or dismissiveness. There was something about that phone conversation with the loan officer that had felt off, a tone I couldn't quite place but recognized from 20 years of navigating white institutional spaces. I arrived at First National Bank at exactly 2 p.m., my appointment time with Robert Sterling, the commercial lending manager. The bank was an imposing building downtown, all marble and mahogany, designed to project stability and prestige. I announced myself to the receptionist, a young white woman who looked me up and down before directing me to wait in the leather seating area. I used those 30 minutes of waiting time productively, reviewing my presentation notes and observing the bank's clientele, mostly white business people who seemed to glide through their transactions with ease. When Sterling finally appeared, he was exactly what I'd expected from his voice on the phone, mid-50s, slightly overweight, with the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He shook my hand with barely any pressure and gestured for me to follow him to his office. I noticed immediately how his demeanor was different from the warm greeting I'd observed him give to a white client just minutes earlier. There was a coldness, a professional distance that felt calculated. His office was decorated with golf trophies and photos of him with various white business leaders from around the city. Not a single image reflected the diversity of Atlanta's population. As I settled into the chair across from his desk, I opened my portfolio and began to introduce myself and my business proposal. I'd gotten exactly 3 sentences into my pitch when he held up his hand to stop me. "Look, Mrs. Turner," he said, not even getting my title right despite the fact that I'd introduced myself as Miss Turner. "I'm going to be honest with you. The kind of loan you're talking about requires substantial collateral and proven business experience in the banking sector. This isn't like getting a car loan or a mortgage. Commercial lending is complex, and frankly, most people don't understand what they're getting into." I felt my jaw tighten, but I maintained my composure. "Mr. Sterling, I have 20 years of experience in financial services, including commercial lending. I've managed portfolios worth over $50 million. If you'd like to review my qualifications," I gestured to the folder I'd prepared. He glanced at the folder without opening it. "I'm sure you have some nice paperwork there, but the reality is that community banks, especially in certain neighborhoods, have a very high failure rate. The regulatory requirements alone would be overwhelming for someone without direct banking industry experience. The phrase certain neighborhoods hung in the air like a racial slur. I knew exactly what he meant, and I could see in his eyes that he knew I knew, but I pressed forward, maintaining my professional tone while my heart rate increased. Mr. Sterling, perhaps we could review my business plan and financial projections. I think you'll find them quite comprehensive. He leaned back in his chair, not touching my folder. The thing is, Mrs. Turner, applications like this require a significant amount of our senior management's time to review. We need to be strategic about which proposals get that level of attention. Typically, we work with clients who have existing relationships with the bank or who come with references from our current commercial customers. I realized what was happening. He was creating barriers that didn't exist, manufacturing requirements that he hadn't mentioned during our initial phone conversation. This was systemic racism in action, the kind that couldn't be easily proven because it hid behind policies and procedures that were selectively applied based on the color of the applicant's skin. I'd be happy to provide references, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. In fact, I have letters of recommendation from 3 current board members of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. For the first time, Sterling looked surprised. He reached for my folder, but I could see the reluctance in his movements. As he flipped through the first few pages, his expression shifted from dismissive to confused to what looked almost like panic. My credit score was 847. My liquid assets exceeded $400,000. My business plan had been reviewed and endorsed by some of the most respected names in banking. This is quite extensive, he admitted, though his tone suggested this was somehow a problem rather than proof of my qualifications. But you have to understand, the current regulatory environment makes it very difficult for new banks to get approval. The FDIC has been particularly strict about capital requirements and management experience. I'd researched every aspect of bank chartering requirements. I knew the regulations better than most people in his position. The FDIC has actually been encouraging the formation of minority-owned banks. I corrected him. There are specific programs designed to support institutions that will serve underbanked communities. Sterling closed my folder without reviewing the financial projections or the detailed market analysis I'd spent months preparing. I think what we need to do is have you meet with our senior vice president of commercial lending. This kind of decision requires someone with more authority than I have. But something in his tone told me this wasn't a step up the ladder. It was a stall tactic. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already crafting his explanation for why this loan couldn't be approved. After 20 years in banking, I knew the difference between legitimate due diligence and discrimination disguised as procedure. When would that meeting be scheduled? I asked. I'll have to check his calendar and get back to you, Sterling replied, already standing to signal the end of our meeting. These things take time to coordinate properly. I gathered my materials, thanked him professionally, and left his office with my dignity intact and my anger carefully controlled. But as I walked through that marble lobby, I felt the familiar weight of being reduced to stereotypes and assumptions. 22 years of excellence, and this man had dismissed me without even reading my qualifications. That evening, I called my mentor, Dr. Patricia Williams, the first Black woman to serve as a regional president for a major national bank. She listened to my account of the meeting with the kind of weary recognition that comes from decades of fighting the same battles. Yolanda, she said, you know what this is. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I spent that night at my kitchen table, writing down everything I could remember about the conversation with Sterling. Every dismissive comment, every assumption, every way he'd moved the goalposts during our brief interaction. I called the bank the next morning to follow up on scheduling the meeting with the senior vice president. The receptionist put me on hold for 10 minutes before returning to tell me that Sterling was out of the office and she couldn't access his calendar. 3 days later, I called again. This time, Sterling answered his own phone. When I identified myself and asked about the follow-up meeting, his tone was noticeably cooler than it had been during our initial conversation. Mrs. Turner, I've discussed your application with my supervisor, and we've determined that your proposal doesn't align with our current lending priorities. We're focusing on existing client relationships and established businesses in this economic climate. I asked for this decision in writing. He said he'd send something out, but no letter ever arrived. When I called a week later, I was told Sterling was in meetings and would call me back. He never did. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my loan application. This was about an institution that felt comfortable dismissing Black applicants because they assumed we wouldn't fight back, wouldn't know our rights, wouldn't have the resources or connections to challenge their discriminatory practices. They had underestimated who they were dealing with. I started by filing a complaint with the bank's corporate headquarters, documenting the timeline of events and Sterling's specific comments. The response came 3 weeks later, a form letter acknowledging my concerns and stating that they would look into the matter while standing behind their lending decisions as based on sound banking principles and regulatory requirements. The dismissive tone of their response told me everything I needed to know. They weren't taking this seriously because they didn't take me seriously, but they had no idea what was coming. I reached out to my network, fellow alumni from Howard University, who were now civil rights attorneys, connections from my years in banking, who had witnessed similar discrimination, community leaders who understood the broader implications of what had happened. Within 2 weeks, I had retained Sarah Mitchell, one of the most respected civil rights lawyers in the Southeast, a sister who had successfully sued 3 major banks for discriminatory lending practices. The first thing Sarah told me was that my case was stronger than most because of my impeccable qualifications and detailed documentation. Banks usually win these cases because they can point to legitimate reasons for denial, she explained. But Sterling's behavior was so blatant, so clearly based on racial assumptions, that he's given us exactly what we need. While Sarah began building the legal case, I took my story to the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP and the National Association of Black Bank Women. I spoke at community forums, sharing my experience not as a victim, but as someone who was fighting back. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of other professionals came forward with similar stories of being dismissed or discriminated against by the same bank. Word of my complaint began to spread through Atlanta's Black professional community. Social media amplified the story, with local bloggers and activists sharing their own experiences with First National Bank. The bank's social media accounts were flooded with questions about their lending practices and their commitment to diversity and inclusion. 2 months after my initial meeting with Sterling, First National Bank requested a meeting with my attorney to discuss resolving this matter. They wanted to settle quietly, to make this go away without admitting any wrongdoing. But I wasn't interested in quiet resolution anymore. This was bigger than my individual experience. It was about changing a system that had been discriminating against Black applicants for decades. Sarah and I decided to file a federal lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. We documented not just my experience, but a pattern of discriminatory practices that had affected hundreds of Black applicants over the past 5 years. We had statistical evidence showing that Black applicants were denied loans at twice the rate of white applicants with similar qualifications. We had testimony from former bank employees who described a culture where loan officers routinely made assumptions about Black applicants' creditworthiness based on racial stereotypes. The day we filed the lawsuit, I held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. Standing behind a podium with microphones from every local news station, I felt the weight of history and the power of truth. This isn't just about Yolanda Turner, I told the assembled reporters. This is about every Black entrepreneur who has been told they're not ready, every Black family who has been steered toward predatory loans, every Black professional who has been judged by their skin color instead of their qualifications. The bank's initial response was predictable. They denied all allegations and claimed my application had been denied for legitimate business reasons. Sterling issued a statement through the bank's public relations firm, saying he had treated me with complete professionalism and that my application simply didn't meet their criteria for approval. But we had evidence they couldn't explain away. Sarah had obtained internal bank emails through the discovery process, including one from Sterling to his supervisor describing me as another one of those community bank dreamers who doesn't understand the complexity of banking regulations. Another email chain revealed that the bank had approved a loan just 2 weeks after denying mine for a white applicant with lower credit scores, less liquid capital, and no banking industry experience. The most damaging evidence came from a former loan officer who had quit First National Bank 6 months earlier, disgusted by what she'd witnessed. Maria Rodriguez was a Latina woman who had worked in Sterling's department for 3 years. She testified that Sterling routinely made racist comments about Black applicants, often joking that they should stick to what they know instead of trying to start businesses they couldn't handle. Maria's testimony was devastating because it revealed the culture Sterling had created in his department. She described meetings where loan applications from Black applicants were dismissed without serious review, where assumptions about creditworthiness were made based on names and photographs, where Sterling would assign Black applications to junior staff members as practice cases because he didn't expect them to be approved anyway. The discovery process also revealed that I wasn't Sterling's only victim. Over the past 3 years, his department had denied loan applications from 17 other highly qualified Black professionals, including a doctor seeking to expand her practice, an engineer wanting to start a construction company, and a retired military officer who planned to open a logistics business. In each case, the pattern was the same: initial encouragement over the phone, followed by dismissive treatment during in-person meetings, followed by denials based on newly invented criteria. As news of the lawsuit spread, the community response was swift and powerful. Black churches announced they were moving their accounts from First National Bank to Black-owned institutions. The Atlanta Black Chamber of Commerce organized a boycott, encouraging their members to find alternative banking relationships. Social media campaigns highlighted the bank's discriminatory practices, with hashtags like #hashbanking, while Black and #Yolanda Turner, justice trending locally. The bank tried to weather the storm, hiring an expensive crisis management firm and launching an advertising campaign emphasizing their commitment to diversity. But the damage was too extensive, the evidence too clear, the community response too organized. Within 4 months, First National Bank had lost over $50 million in deposits from Black customers and community organizations. The turning point came when the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta announced they were reviewing First National's lending practices for potential regulatory violations. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency opened a parallel investigation. Sterling was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of both investigations. 6 months after filing the lawsuit, we received a settlement offer that exceeded our wildest expectations. First National Bank agreed to pay $3 million in damages, $500,000 to me personally, $800,000 to establish a loan fund for Black entrepreneurs, and $1 million to fund financial literacy programs in underserved communities. They also agreed to comprehensive changes in their lending practices, including mandatory bias training for all loan officers and the establishment of a community oversight board to monitor their progress. But the money wasn't the most satisfying part of the settlement. The bank also agreed to provide me with the loan I had originally requested, at prime rate, with terms that supported my vision for a community development financial institution. They would also serve as the correspondent bank for my new institution, providing the infrastructure support that would make our success possible. The day we signed the settlement agreement, I thought about Grandma Essie and her father's coffee can buried in the backyard. I thought about all the Black entrepreneurs who had been told no over the years, all the dreams that had been deferred because of systemic discrimination. And I thought about the future we were creating, a future where Black professionals wouldn't have to face the kind of dismissiveness and discrimination I had experienced. Sterling was quietly terminated from the bank, though the official announcement described it as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. He landed at a smaller regional bank outside Atlanta, but his reputation in the industry had been permanently damaged. More importantly, his removal sent a message throughout First National Bank that discriminatory practices would no longer be tolerated or protected. The changes at First National were immediate and substantial. They hired Dr. Kenneth Thompson, a respected Black banking executive, as their new senior vice president of community development. They established partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities to recruit diverse talent. They created a small business lending program specifically designed to serve entrepreneurs in underbanked communities. But institutional change is a marathon, not a sprint. Even with new policies and leadership, changing a culture that had tolerated discrimination for decades required constant vigilance. I worked with the Community Oversight Board to monitor the bank's progress, reviewing lending data quarterly and investigating any complaints from Black applicants. A year after the settlement, the results spoke for themselves. First National Bank had increased their lending to Black-owned businesses by 340%. Customer satisfaction scores in Black communities had improved dramatically. Most importantly, other financial institutions in Atlanta had taken notice, implementing their own policy changes to avoid facing similar lawsuits and community backlash. My own community development financial institution, Essie's Bank, named for my grandmother, opened its doors 18 months after that initial discriminatory meeting with Sterling. We started with $3 million in capital, including my settlement funds, investments from Black professionals throughout Atlanta, and a community development grant from the Treasury Department's CDFI fund. Our mission was simple: to provide financial services that respected the intelligence and dignity of every customer, regardless of their background. From day one, Essie's Bank operated differently. Our loan officers received extensive training not just in financial analysis, but in cultural competency and unconscious bias recognition. We established partnerships with Black churches, community organizations, and professional associations to reach customers who had been underserved by traditional banks. Most importantly, we created a culture where every customer was treated with respect and every application was given serious consideration. The impact rippled through the community in ways I hadn't anticipated. Young Black professionals who had been considering leaving Atlanta for cities with better banking relationships decided to stay and build their businesses here. Established Black entrepreneurs expanded their operations, knowing they had access to capital that respected their expertise. Churches and nonprofits found financing for community development projects that had languished for years while they searched for supportive lenders. Within 2 years, Essie's Bank had assets of $25 million and had made over 300 loans to Black-owned businesses and community organizations. We had proven that serving our community wasn't just morally right, it was profitable. Our loan default rate was actually lower than the industry average because we took the time to understand our customers' businesses and provided ongoing support for their success. The success of Essie's Bank also validated something I'd known all along, that Black entrepreneurs weren't asking for handouts or special treatment. We were asking for the same fair consideration that white applicants received automatically. When that happened, when our qualifications were evaluated without the filter of racial bias, we succeeded at rates that matched or exceeded our white counterparts. The legal victory and the bank's success transformed me from a banking professional into a community leader and advocate. I began speaking at conferences about discriminatory lending practices, sharing my story as both a cautionary tale and a model for fighting back. Law schools invited me to discuss the legal strategies that had made our case successful. Business schools used Essie's Bank as a case study in community development finance, but the most meaningful recognition came from my own community. At the annual gala for the Atlanta chapter of the National Association of Black Bank Women, I received their Lifetime Achievement Award for advancing economic justice in the Black community. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of brilliant Black women who were changing the financial services industry, I felt the full weight of what we had accomplished together. The personal healing took longer than the institutional changes. For months after the settlement, I struggled with anger about the time that had been stolen from me, the energy that had been diverted from building my business toward fighting discrimination. I worked with a therapist who specialized in racial trauma, learning to process the psychological impact of being systematically underestimated and dismissed. Jordan was my anchor throughout the entire process, reminding me on difficult days that our fight was about more than just our individual success. "You're not just opening a bank," he would tell me. "You're opening doors for every Black entrepreneur who comes after you." That perspective helped me see the lawsuit not as a personal vendetta, but as a contribution to the broader struggle for economic justice. The community support never wavered. Church mothers who had lived through segregation would stop me at the grocery store to tell me how proud they were that I had fought back. Young professionals would approach me at networking events to share their own stories of discrimination and ask for advice on documenting and reporting bias. Parents told me they were using my story to teach their children about standing up for themselves while pursuing excellence. Dr. Williams, my mentor, reminded me that every generation of Black professionals had to fight similar battles. "The difference," she said, "is that you fought back with the tools our ancestors gave you: preparation, community support, and an unshakable belief in your own worth. And you won in a way that helps the next generation fight their battles from a stronger position." 3 years later, as I write this story, the changes continue to reverberate throughout Atlanta's financial services industry. Essie's Bank has grown to assets of $75 million and has been recognized by the Treasury Department as one of the most successful new community development financial institutions in the country. We've made over 800 loans to Black-owned businesses, helped 200 families become first-time homeowners, and supported community development projects that have created thousands of jobs. More broadly, our lawsuit established legal precedent that has been cited in discrimination cases across the Southeast. The Fair Lending Coalition, which formed in response to our case, has successfully challenged discriminatory practices at 4 other financial institutions. Most importantly, the conversation about bias in lending has shifted from whether it exists to how to eliminate it. But systemic change requires ongoing vigilance. Even with new policies and leadership, discrimination doesn't disappear overnight. It evolves, becoming more subtle and harder to detect. That's why I continue to serve on the Community Oversight Board at First National Bank, reviewing their lending data and investigating complaints. It's why Essie's Bank participates in regular audits of our own practices, ensuring that we live up to our values as we grow. The personal cost of fighting racism is real and shouldn't be minimized. The stress of the lawsuit, the constant media attention, the emotional labor of educating people about systemic bias, all of that takes a toll. There were nights when I questioned whether the fight was worth it, whether I should have just found another bank and moved on with my life. But then I think about the 17 other Black professionals whose applications Sterling had dismissed, the hundreds of entrepreneurs who are now able to access capital through Essie's Bank, the young professionals who approach me at conferences to say that my story inspired them to fight their own battles. The personal cost was high, but the community benefit has been immeasurable. Standing here today, I see progress that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. Black entrepreneurship in Atlanta has increased by 60% since Essie's Bank opened. Other community development financial institutions have followed our model, expanding access to capital in underserved communities throughout the Southeast. Major banks have hired chief diversity officers and implemented bias training programs, not out of altruism, but because they know the community is watching and won't tolerate discrimination anymore. The lesson I want every Black person watching this to understand is that you don't have to accept discrimination as the price of pursuing your dreams. You have rights, you have community, and you have power. More power than the systems of oppression want you to realize. When you're prepared, when you document everything, when you build strategic alliances, you can fight institutional racism and win. But individual victories aren't enough. Real change happens when we turn our personal success into community empowerment, when we use our resources and platforms to create opportunities for others. That's why Essie's Bank isn't just my business. It's our institution, built by and for a community that refused to accept second-class treatment in the financial services industry. To my Black viewers specifically, your experiences of discrimination are real, your anger is justified, and your dreams are valid. Don't let anyone tell you that you're being too sensitive or reading too much into situations. Trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that you're not fighting these battles alone. We have ancestors who faced worse and survived. We have community members who will support you, and we have legal tools that can create accountability for discriminatory practices. Here are 3 concrete steps you can take if you face discrimination in banking or lending. First, document everything in writing immediately after it happens, including dates, times, specific words used, and names of witnesses. Second, file complaints with both the financial institution and the appropriate regulatory agencies, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for federal issues, your state banking commission for local institutions. Third, connect with civil rights organizations in your community who can provide legal resources and strategic support. The road to economic justice is long, and setbacks are inevitable. But every time we fight back against discrimination, every time we demand the respect we deserve, every time we build institutions that serve our community's needs, we're contributing to a movement that's bigger than any individual experience. We're creating a future where Black excellence is recognized and rewarded, where our children won't have to face the same barriers we've confronted. If my story resonates with you, if you've faced similar discrimination, or if you believe in the vision of economic justice I've described, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel and share your own experiences in the comments. Let's build a community of people who refuse to accept discrimination as normal, who support each other's success, and who work together to create systemic change. Remember, you are not too sensitive, you are not imagining things, and you are not alone. Every door they try to close, we kick open with our excellence, our unity, and our unshakable belief that we deserve better. The fight continues, but so does our power to change the system that has underestimated us for too long. Sterling thought he was dismissing just another Black applicant who would quietly accept rejection and move on. He had no idea he was dealing with Yolanda Turner, granddaughter of Essie Mae Williams, backed by a community that had been preparing for this fight for generations. He had no idea what was coming, and neither do the other institutions that continue to discriminate against our community. But now they know, and change is coming, one victory at a time.